Caldwell County and the town of Lenoir were created by an act of the North Carolina General Assembly in January of 1841. During the 20 years following the county's birth, the citizens of the county enjoyed an almost uninterrupted period of growth and prosperity. Most people were far too busy with their daily lives to take more than passing interest in national issues. There had been slave ownership in this area almost from the time of first settlement. The topography of the county dictated the type of farming practices which could be economically undertaken. These practices did not allow for plantation methods where large numbers of slaves were deemed necessary and profitable. Thus, the majority of slave ownership in the county was rather small in comparison to the eastern counties of North Carolina, where tobacco was the principal crop, or in the Deep South, where cotton was king. Caldwell County historian Nancy Alexander wrote in Here Will I Dwell.
Our people were so busy with farming, schools, building roads, and starting industries that they didn't get very excited over the problems of slavery that involved faraway Oregon and Kansas, and felt that slavery was more or less an accepted institution. By 1857, the mounting hysteria was reaching this part of the state, and sectional hatred had developed to the extent that people who did not advocate slavery were treated as traitors.
National events began to filter into Caldwell County. In 1859, news of John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry caused the citizens of the county to fear the repercussions of a slave rebellion. Many residents began to question their views on slavery. Abolitionists began publishing books and pamphlets decrying the evils of slavery. Many families in the county began to splinter over their divergent views on the subject.
The Estes family saw several members of their clan leave the area, choosing to live in states that did not allow slavery. Jesse Moore Estes, a grandson of both Reuben Estes of Johns River and of Jesse Moore Jr. of the Globe, moved to Wisconsin, where he published a number of anti-slavery pamphlets, much to the disapproval of his relatives here. He would later serve in the Union Army, fighting against his relatives.
The industrialized North and the largely agrarian South were divided in their views on almost every issue, with the South espousing a states' rights stand. Both sides avoided the question of slavery, leaving the issue to a vocal minority. The two political parties of the day, the Whigs and the Democrats, likewise skirted the issue. In 1854, a new political party, the Republican Party, sprang from the ashes of the old Whig Party. The party attracted a large number of free soil Democrats in northern states who believed that free labor was superior to slavery. The Republican Party candidate in 1856, John C. Fremont, campaigned on the slogan, "Free soil, free labor, free speech, free men."
Michael Hardy stated in his book, The 58th North Carolina Troops, that the party had no support in the South and that many Southerners viewed it as a dissentious organization that threatened civil war.
The election of 1860 saw the Republican Party nominate Abraham Lincoln, while the Democrats splintered. Northern Democrats nominated Stephen H. Douglas, while Southern Democrats nominated John C. Breckinridge, virtually assuring Lincoln of the victory, even though Lincoln was omitted from the ballot throughout the South, including the ballot in Caldwell County.
When Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States in 1860, and was known to be greatly opposed to the further spread of slavery, there was much concern in this vicinity.
Following Lincoln's election, South Carolina held a secession convention at Charleston and voted unanimously to secede on December 20th, 1860. They were quickly followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. North Carolina chose to take a wait-and-see attitude. Zebulon Baird Vance, a western North Carolina politician and later a governor of the state, urged restraint. He wrote a letter in December to Caldwell County Representative William Dixon, in which he stated,
"We have everything to gain and nothing on earth to lose by delay. But by too hasty action, we may take a fatal step that we can never retrace. We may lose a heritage that we can never recover."
Columbus Anson Tuttle, son of Lucius McCall Tuttle and member of Company I of the 26th Regiment, later wrote in a series of articles for the Lenore News topic,
"As the states seceded, their senators and representatives resigned their seats in the Congress of the United States. Lincoln denied the right of the South to secede from the Union. The Confederate Provisional Congress took steps to organize an army. Southern officers in the regular army resigned in large numbers and offered their service to several states. To Robert E. Lee was offered the command of the Union Army. He declined and was given command of the Virginia Confederate forces.
In January of 1861, the North Carolina General Assembly passed the Convention Act, directing each county to take a vote on February 28th on whether to call for a state convention to consider secession and to elect a delegate to serve if the convention referendum passed. Caldwell County voted overwhelmingly against secession, naming Edmund Walter Jones as our delegate. The state referendum failed by a slim margin, and the convention was not called.
Sentiment changed when Mr. Lincoln sent supplies to the federal garrison at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. Confederate troops fired on the fort on April 12th and took control of it 2 days later.
President Lincoln issued a call on April 15th for each state to furnish troops to halt the rebellion. North Carolina was requested to send 2 regiments of militia to serve in the Union Army. This move served to unify North Carolina and Caldwell County, directing our support to the Confederacy. North Carolina Governor John W. Ellis stated,
"I can be no party to this wicked violation of the laws of the country and to the war upon the liberties of a free people. You can get no troops from North Carolina."
In Caldwell County, as well as across the state, passions ran high. Meetings were held at the courthouse. Fiery speeches were delivered, whipping the citizenry into a fever in favor of secession and war if necessary. Governor Ellis called the General Assembly into emergency session on May 1st. The General Assembly called for the convention. On May 20th, 1861, North Carolina held the convention in Raleigh and voted unanimously to secede from the Union. Mr. Jones cast Caldwell County's vote. North Carolina became the last of the 11 states to join the Confederacy. The Confederate States of America put out a call for volunteers, which was answered immediately by Caldwell County men.
Before the war ended, 7 companies had been raised in the county.
Company A of the 22nd North Carolina Regiment, called the Rough and Ready Boys, was the first company organized in the county. Enrollment in the company actually began in the middle of April of 1861, before secession took place.
An article that appeared in the Lenore News in 1908 stated,
"The election for officers took place in front of the jail. The officers were chosen by men rallying around their respective candidates. William Franklin Jones was elected captain on account of his military record." On June 3, 1861, a ceremony was held on the square in Lenore honoring Company A's departure. Speeches were given by distinguished county leaders Samuel Finley Patterson, William Franklin Jones, Walter Waitsel Lenore, and Sidney Patterson Dula. The company then marched to the town of Hickory Tavern, now called Hickory, where they boarded a train to Raleigh.
Mr. Jones was 55 years old when he took command of Company A. He quickly found he was unsuited to camp life and resigned. Thomas Dula Jones was named captain on August 8, 1861, serving until he was killed at Seven Pines, Virginia on May 31, 1862. William Bogle Clark served as the last captain of Company A.
My great-grandfather, Samuel Finley Harper, son of James Harper, is quoted by W. W. Scott as saying, "I was in school in Lenore at the age of 17 and begged my parents to let me go with some of my schoolmates. They consented and I volunteered." Companies were coming into Raleigh every day for drilling and organizing. Ours was the 22nd Regiment, and J. Johnson Pettigrew was elected colonel. Our company was A. A few days after the First Battle of Manassas, we were ordered to Richmond.
Company A participated in every major battle involving the Army of Virginia, including the battles of Seven Pines, Shepherdstown, Chancellorsville, and Gettysburg. Chancellorsville may have been the battle that contributed to the ultimate defeat of the Confederacy. Members of Company A were standing guard duty when they were approached by an unknown group of mounted men. Fire erupted, and General Stonewall Jackson was mortally wounded, most likely by friendly fire. Mr. Aurelius James Dula, son of Alfred Dula of the Yadkin Valley area of Caldwell, later wrote,
"I was on guard when the firing was going on. One of our boys raised his gun to shoot, and General A.P. Hill pulled his gun down, told him not to shoot as he would kill some of our men. I suppose it will never be known who did kill General Jackson, for there was so much shooting."
Mr. Dula was wounded several times in the battles of Gaines Mill, Virginia, Gettysburg, and finally near Petersburg, where he was captured and confined at Point Lookout, Maryland, until the end of the war.
The second company of Caldwell County men to organize was the High Brighton Guards. Nathaniel Patterson Rankin, a teacher at Findlay High School in Lenore, resigned his teaching duties to help organize the company. Mr. Rankin became company captain, later promoted to major. They left Lenore July 31st, 1861.
Miss Laura Lenore Norwood, daughter of Joseph Caldwell Norwood, whose plantation, Oaklawn, occupied the former Tucker's barn site, later wrote,
"I and 12 other little girls, dressed in white dresses and blue ribbons, representing the 13 Confederate states, were present when the High Brighton Guards left Lenore. This was the famous Company F of the 26th NC Troops, which at Gettysburg lost more men in killed and wounded than any other in the Confederate service."
Romulus Morrison Tuttle, eldest son of Lucius M. Tuttle, was elected a captain of Company F and later became a Presbyterian minister. He wrote of the Gettysburg battle.
The company went into action with 88 muskets and 3 commissioned officers, making 91 men. In the engagement that followed, every officer and every man of it bled or died from wounds received.
Members of this company took part in Pickett's charge and were among the few Confederate soldiers who reached the rock wall on Cemetery Ridge that has been referred as the high water mark of the Confederacy, before being forced to retreat.
On Monday, August 15, 1861, the third company from Caldwell, which was Company 1, called the Caldwell Guards, left the county. Its captains were Wilson Austin White, John Thomas Jones, and Nero Guy Bradford. This company served with the regiment in many battles, including Rawls Mills, Gettysburg, and the Battle of the Wilderness. When the 26th was on its way to Gettysburg, General Lee remarked, "That is the finest regiment I ever saw."
Company Z and H of the 58th Regiment served in the Western Theater of Operation, fighting primarily in Tennessee and Georgia for the most of the war. Alfred Theodore Stewart, who first served in Company F of the 26th, became captain of Company E and was killed at Jonesboro, Georgia. He was replaced by Thomas Jefferson Coffee. The officers of Company H were Captains Thomas Joshua Dula, who was eventually promoted to Lieutenant Colonel, and George Washington Finley Harper, who achieved the rank of Major, a title he would retain for the rest of his life. The unit served at Missionary Ridge and was present at the fall of Atlanta, having been sent east in 1864 to aid in the defense of the city. The 58th Regiment would return to North Carolina in early 1865, where it took part in the Battle of Bentonville, North Carolina, in April of 1865.
Scores of other Caldwell County men enlisted in units raised in surrounding counties, and many others traveled to various encampments throughout the state to enlist. It has been estimated that as many as 1,500 men from Caldwell County served in Confederate units, more than the eligible voters in the 1860 election. Many other men, the elderly and those too young to enlist, served in the Home Guard or the Junior Reserves, laboring to protect the citizenry.
Almost every family in Caldwell County contributed sons to the Confederate Army. Many families contributed their entire male population. William Deal of the Deals Mill community of southern Caldwell County served in the Home Guard, and all 6 of his sons fought throughout the war, with son Rufus falling at Cold Harbor, Virginia.
Men not killed in battle, the wounded and captured were taken to prison of war camps. Many Caldwell prisoners were held at Camp Chase, Fort Delaware, Point Lookout, and Johnson's Island. Early in the war, captured soldiers were exchanged and could return to battle, but later the exchange program was stopped, causing many of our men to endure extreme hardship and sometimes death in the Union prisons. The Union forces were able to blockade the Confederate ports, disrupting the flow of military and civilian supplies. Hardship and deprivation followed throughout the South.
The longer the war continued, the greater the shortages became. Meat almost disappeared. There was no coffee or tea. Dried apples and peaches were a great treat. Children and many grown-ups went barefoot through the winter. One pair of shoes a year was a luxury. Sheets, carpets, curtains were torn for use in the hospitals.
Even though Caldwell County was not on the front lines of battle, the people felt the effects of the war. When the Confederacy discontinued postal service with the United States, postmasters were given permission to create their own stamps. G.W.F. Harper, who ran the post office for his father, designed a die made from holly tree wood, which read, "Lenore N.C. 5 paid." There were decorative ornaments in each of the 4 corners of the stamp as well. The first stamp was issued on September 18, 1861. There is some evidence that around 1864, a post office or mail stop operated at Buck Shoals near the present town of Hudson.
The absence of so many men from the county for extended periods of time caused women and children to assume the role of primary breadwinner in the family. During the war, women began seeking employment outside of the home, especially in the cotton mills.
Almost all of the soldiers from Caldwell County fought for the Confederacy, but some chose to fight on the Union side. At least 31 men chose to enlist in the 2 Union units formed in eastern Tennessee. Each unit consisted primarily of western North Carolina men. The 2nd North Carolina Mounted Infantry Unit was formed late in 1863. It included 21 men from Caldwell County. The 3rd North Carolina Mounted Infantry was formed on February 13, 1864, and included an additional 10 men from Caldwell County. The 2 units were assigned to guard mountain passes, support Stoneman's rear, and to raid western North Carolina towns. While no battles were fought in Caldwell County during the war, there were a number of raids carried on by George Kirk and his marauders. Operating out of East Tennessee into the county, Kirk was joined by several men and one woman who were Caldwell natives.
Keith Blaylock joined Company F of the 26th Regiment, hoping to come to close contact with enemy forces so he could desert and join the Union Army. His wife, Melinda Pritchard Blaylock, refused to be separated from him. She disguised herself as a man and joined the same unit.
After 2 months, no contact was made with Union forces. Blaylock spread poison sumac juice on his body and acquired a rash that the company doctor could not identify. He received a medical discharge. Melinda Blaylock was released from service after proving her gender and joined her husband as a part of Kirk's bushwhackers. Kirk and his raiders harassed all of western North Carolina, and particularly the Globe area of Caldwell County. These raids served to undermine the morale of Caldwell's citizens. During the first year and a half of the war, President Lincoln steadfastly stated that the purpose of the war was the preservation of the Union. By September of 1862, the Confederate forces had been superior to the Union forces, although at great cost in terms of irreplaceable men and material. Support for the war was waning in the North. Lincoln needed something to re-energize support. On September 16, 1862, Lee's army met General George McClellan's army at Sharpsburg, Maryland, in the battle known as Antietam. The battle ended in a draw, but the Union claimed victory, giving Mr. Lincoln a reason to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which, when it became effective on January 1, 1863, changed the purpose of the war to the freedom of the slaves in the minds of most Southerners. Company A of the 22nd Regiment arrived at the Antietam Battle late in the day on September 17th, following a forced march from the Confederate capture of Harper's Ferry. G.W.F. Harper wrote,
"We arrived just in time to arrest the advance of Burnside's corps, who had at last carried the stone bridge and was about to cut off Lee's army from the river. This saved our army from capture."
In Caldwell County, construction was virtually non-existent during the war years. Almost all economic activity was directed towards supplying the Army. The county did receive a large influx of refugees from East Tennessee who were fleeing the Union Army. Green Moore and his large family arrived in Lenoir in 1862. Mr. Moore leased the Miller Inn on the square on a portion of Town Lot Number 3. Mr. Moore's son, Martin Van Buren Moore, would establish his mercantile firm, M.V. Moore and Brother, in the building in 1865.
As 1865 began, the war was virtually lost. Robert E. Lee had been defeated at Gettysburg in July of 1863, and in company with his remaining troops, including men from Caldwell County, had been in constant retreat. In March of 1865, General George Stoneman's Union troops began a sweep through western North Carolina with the objective of destroying the railroads in western North Carolina and southern Virginia. The main Confederate forces that were left in the western and Piedmont sections of the state were garrisoned at Asheville and Salisbury, while in between there were only senior reserves, Home Guard, Avery's battalion, and a handful of irregular troops. Major A.C. Avery's 17th Battalion consisted of 3 companies, with 1 company from Caldwell County under the command of Captain Nelson A. Miller. The battalion was organized to protect western North Carolina from the incursion of the bushwhackers from eastern Tennessee. Major Avery was taken prisoner by Stoneman's men, but he used an assumed name and was never recognized by his captors. One group of Stoneman's men first visited Caldwell County on March 30th, marching from Blowing Rock. They camped at Patterson and marched down the Yadkin River on their way to Wilkes County. W. Scott, an early historian, wrote in his Annals of Caldwell County,
The woolen mill at Patterson, which was the first to be built in Caldwell County in 1858 and belonged to Colonel J.C. Harper, was visited by a detachment of Stoneman's men. The factory was burned. Numerous houses and barns were burned by the Yankees during their raids through this section, and in most cases, devastation and destruction were left in their wake. The mill at Patterson was the only cotton mill in a radius of near 100 miles, and it was run to the utmost capacity day and night. The mill was of such serious importance that it required the constant protection of the Home Guard.
The loss of the mill was devastating to the dwindling hopes of the Confederacy, and it dealt a serious blow to Caldwell County's recovery efforts following the war. After leaving Caldwell County, Stoneman led his army into southern Virginia and later returned to North Carolina by way of Salisbury and Statesville. On April 15th, Stoneman re-entered Caldwell County from Taylorsville.
Arriving in Lenoir, which they called a rebellious little hole, the raiders placed their prisoners, reported to be about 900 in number, who were weary, ragged, many of them barefoot, sick, and almost dead of exhaustion, in the St. James Episcopal Church and grounds, stationing troops about the place. The Albert Hagler home was an old log house which was converted into headquarters for the officers. General Stoneman made his headquarters in the Episcopal Rectory.
Almost all of the homes and buildings in Lenoir were entered and ransacked. Davenport College and Findlay High School were heavily damaged and the contents taken or destroyed, but the buildings were left standing. The residence hall at Findlay High School was burned. Most of the food and valuables that could not be hidden were taken, as was all of the livestock. The courthouse was damaged, with most of the windows broken out. Lenoir was virtually destroyed. There was widespread looting and burning carried on throughout the county.
One company of Stoneman's men that had been routed through Hickory Tavern camped on the Catawba River in Granite Falls, then known as Catawba View, on Saturday night. On Sunday afternoon, they joined the Lenoir contingency before heading west.
Davenport College, which had opened in 1858, operated continuously throughout the war until college president George F. Round sent the students home when word was received that Stoneman's army was camped at Blowing Rock. Once the invaders departed, citizens of Lenoir and Caldwell County united in their generosity and were able to gather enough equipment to allow the school to resume operation later in 1865.
It is ironic that the occupation of Lenoir took place 6 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. President Lee's surrender were a number of soldiers from Caldwell County, including C.A. Tuttle and S.F. Harper.
On the morning of April 9, 1865, General Lee sent a flag of truce to General Grant asking for an interview. And the same morning, the two generals met at the home of Mr. Wilmer McLean in the village of Appomattox Courthouse, and the terms of the surrender were agreed upon.
When the surrender was announced, I have never seen such grief, and it was the saddest day I ever spent. I could not believe that this, the bravest, most daring and invincible army that history has any record of, which had stood poorly equipped and had driven back for 4 years army after army, and now to be disbanded and never assembled as an army again.
It required several days to parole those surrendered. Some escaped to join Johnson's army and refused to surrender. Then in groups and squads, or one by one, thousands of them, penniless, many with hundreds of miles to travel, without money or means of transportation, made their way home. I was 11 days coming home from Appomattox.
On the same day that Stoneman's troops entered Caldwell County, President Abraham Lincoln died from an assassin's bullet. Lincoln's death, most likely, changed the course of Reconstruction in the South. He had advocated a lenient policy for the South. Vice President Andrew Johnson assumed the presidency, ill-equipped for the job. Johnson faced extreme pressure from a radical Congress and cabinet. Determined to punish the South, he buckled to the pressure and chose to reject Lincoln's policy of leniency. On April 18, 1865, General William Sherman accepted the surrender of the last Confederate Army, commanded by General Joseph E. Johnston at the Bennett Farm near Durham, North Carolina. Sherman had offered lenient terms to Johnston. President Johnson rejected the lenient terms, ordered Sherman to demand far stricter terms, and forced Johnston to surrender a second time on April 26, 1865. Troops from Caldwell County were present at the final surrender. On May 29, 1865, President Johnson granted amnesty to all white Southerners who would take an oath of loyalty to the Union. Those taking the oath were allowed to reclaim their property. 28 Caldwell County men are listed in the book North Carolina Petitions for Presidential Pardon, 1865 to 1868, by Russell S. Kuntz. Among those are various postmasters of the rural stations, including James Harper of Lenoir and James Clarence Harper of Patterson. Others included Matthias Alexander Bernhardt, assessor, and Edmund W. Jones, member of the Secession Convention.
When the war ended, Caldwell, as the rest of the South, before any provisional government had been set up, was left without any law enforcement officers. The Home Guard, with the help of returning Confederate soldiers, served in the interim, attempting to enforce order. Bands of lawless men roamed the countryside, destroying and killing.
The economy of the South was virtually destroyed by the war. An extended period of poverty gripped Caldwell County. A letter by an unknown author in 1869 stated,
I'm in a county which contributed nearly the entire population to the rebel service and is still under the old-fashioned pro-slavery influence. The town itself is a memento to the twin evils of slavery and of war. It is the county seat, but the courthouse is closed, desolate, and decayed. Nearly all the windows broken out, and there's no sign of county officials. The principal exports from this county are roots and herbs. There is a scarcity of money. I was told last night that in the whole county of Caldwell, there were not 5 men who could lay their hands upon $1,000 of their own money.
When the war ended, there were only 300 people living in the town of Lenoir.
On October 18, 1865, the North Carolina legislature repealed the Articles of Secession. North Carolina was placed under the 2nd Military District and placed under martial law administered by federal troops. On December 18, 1865, North Carolina adopted the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, abolishing slavery in the nation. North Carolina was officially readmitted to the Union on July 4, 1868, when it ratified the 14th Amendment, declaring former slaves as legal citizens and defining their rights. North Carolina suffered at the hands of carpetbaggers, recent arrivers from the North, and scalawags, white Southerners who supported the carpetbaggers. Fortunately for Caldwell County, there was a friendly voice among the invaders. Colonel Clinton Albert Silly, a native of New Hampshire and an officer in the Union Army during the war and a Medal of Honor winner, was appointed regional administrator of the Freedmen's Bureau for the Western District.
The administration of Mr. Silly was characterized by such wisdom, justice, equity, fine courtesy, and sincere consideration for the feelings of a brave and saddened people that they embraced him, adopted him into the tribe, put him and his Confederate comrades to work upbuilding the state.
Mr. Silly moved to Lenoir, set up a law practice and a law school in town. In 1868, he married Emma Harper, daughter of James Clarence Harper, and would become one of the earliest mayors of the town. Mr. Silly was chosen as one of the first worshipful masters of the Caldwell chapter of the Masonic Lodge. G.W.F. Harper had a third floor added to his store building on Town Lot 4 in 1867 to serve as the meeting room for the lodge. This was the first project of any kind taking place except for the repairs that had to take place as the result of war destruction.
With the ending of the war, the freed Negroes moved into crude dwellings, which they built in sections which were more or less isolated and which were out of the city limits at that time. West End was for many years called Scratch Ankle and Freedman. Offices in the courthouse were closed and the town appeared desolate. There were no great flare-ups and difficulties as there were in other parts of the country.
With the return of the soldiers to the rural areas of the county, farming resumed much as it had been practiced prior to the war. The county schools had been suspended for most part during the war, and some began to reopen about 1867. New school districts were created in 1868 and, although the schools were segregated, the same district lines applied for both white students and the children of former slaves.
In April of 1868, North Carolina adopted a new state constitution, eliminating the old Court of Pleas and Quarter Sessions, replacing it with a board of county commissioners to administer each county. At the same time, cities and towns throughout the state began electing their own mayors and councilmen to govern their affairs.
County records show that the first county commission consisted of Robert Gaius Tuttle, Allen Laxton, Lewis Hartley, McCaleb Coffey, and Cornelius Wellington Clark. Lenoir's records show that Edward W. Fawcett was the first mayor and that G.W.F. Harper and Samuel Hartley served as councilmen. The South, North Carolina, and Caldwell County were defeated in war, but they were unbending in their belief that their position had been justified. Men and women alike felt that the war was not a civil war, but a war of northern aggression. This belief would be voiced by our citizenry well into the 20th century. The years from 1861 to 1870 saw the county change from a prosperous, thriving area to one devastated by the ravages of war and Reconstruction. Through hard work and perseverance, our citizens began to emerge from the dark years and move toward a time that would transform Lenoir and Caldwell County into a powerhouse of industry.
Thank you.